Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Dr. Spotfire. Today, we're joined with Peter McInnes, where he will talk about the authentication and authorization in Spotfire Platform. Before that, I would like to have an announcement. We have two new members in Dr. Spotfire. That's Danny Topolsky and myself, Athir Alatar. Since Neil is no longer with Dr. Spotfire, and then I would like to take the chance to thank him for all what he did to Dr. Spotfire. Dr. Spotfire is aired every first Tuesday of every month at 11 a.m. CST, so don't forget to tune in for our future sessions. With that, I will hand it off to you, Peter.
Okay. Thank you, Athir. Let me share my screen. Yeah, as Athir said, so I'll be okay, so there it goes. Okay, so yeah, so I'll be talking about authentication authorization in Spotfire and some other security aspects. I'm going to just kind of go through various topics kind of at a high level, not going into details about them, so we can have time to get through the material as well as just kind of it's just an introduction to things. So first off, what can you learn from this session? So we're going to talk about Spotfire authentication. There are many options for authentication. We'll talk about we'll kind of introduce all of them, but we'll talk about some of the more ones that are used most often. And then we'll talk about authorization. So that's how controlling what the user can do and see within the Spotfire environment. And then, if you have time, we'll talk a little about Spotfire data security at the end. So first off, the entire environment in Spotfire can be secure. You can use HTTPS, which is recommended to communicate with the Spotfire environment. I will go through talking about authentication and authorization and the various aspects that are listed there. And then you can also control what users can do. So as far as entitlement and what they can do within the environment. So first off, I want to define authentication authorizations so we understand what we're talking about. So first off, authentication is verifying you are who you claim to be. So for example, username and then a password will verify that you are who you say you are because it's something you know. And then authorization is verifying what you can do within the environment. So once you're authenticated and your identity is confirmed with the environment, then it's just authorization is determining what can you do, what do you have access to do, what do you have access to see. So that's like an administrative versus a regular user. So today we're going to be spending, this is a view of this whole Spotfire platform. Today we're going to be focusing on the Spotfire server because that's where all the authentication and authorization occurs as far as coordinating that within the Spotfire environment. So if you're using, like, for example, Active Directory for authentication, now Spotfire server will initiate that. For example, initiate the login screen for the user, but they'll pass those credentials on to Active Directory to determine whether you've correctly entered them and whether you can enter the environment. And then the Spotfire server also handles the Spotfire library, and then the authorization is controlling who you say you are, controlling what you can do within the environment. Most authentication actually occurs kind of outside the Spotfire environment. We'll talk about the various authentication methods, and Spotfire just kind of is the manager of those, so that Spotfire server in the end gets an identity to know who you are. But all the clients, the Spotfire analyst that's installed on your desktop, the web browser, consumer business author, and then mobile apps, and then any web service clients, they all go through the Spotfire server in order to be authenticated and then authorized to determine what they can do within any other services or components of the environment. So as far as the various authentication methods, there's different types of them. There's username and password. So that's you enter your credentials into the Spotfire environment. So the Spotfire database is when the Spotfire database is being used for authentication. In that case, the username and password are in the Spotfire database. The password is encrypted. But in that case, it's all just right there. That's typically not used except maybe in a short test environment or environment you just want to get Spotfire up and running. Typically, we see Active Directory being used as the method of authentication. So in that case, you are presented with a username and password dialog by Spotfire, but then that information is passed on to Active Directory, and Spotfire doesn't even know or hold on to the password. We just hold on to the identity of the user. Windows NT and custom Java authentication authorization services are less used. For single sign-on, when the case is you're not actually entering a username and password into Spotfire, but you would have entered it someplace else or at another time maybe. OpenID, so OpenID Connect, and then web authentication. So that's in the case when you're using an identity provider like Okta or Azure, or there's various ones of those or think about Google, or you're logging in to that provider, and then Spotfire actually only gets the token information back. So you go through kind of the flow. You're sent to the identity provider. If you're already logged in, you don't have to enter it again. But if you logged into some other, maybe some other service within your corporation or something like that, you've already logged in. You don't have to log in again. But Spotfire will get a token that is needed to determine your identity. External authentication is typically used in the case of portals. So in that case, you've authenticated external to Spotfire. So you've already authenticated. Maybe there's some cookie or information within your browser that can help Spotfire learn your identity. Kerberos was used quite a bit for single sign-on. It's kind of a complex to configure, but it is very secure. But it's used less and less as people move to the cloud, because it's pretty near impossible to do it with the cloud based on how, especially Windows deals with domains and things like that. NTLM and X509 client certificates are used, are used less. Anonymous, it's called anonymous authentication, but with anonymous authentication, you actually aren't authenticated, or you are authenticated as a specific user within the Spotfire environment. And that's useful if you're doing maybe a blog or some sort of, you want some analysis files that are publicly available, and you don't want the users to have to log in to the environment. So so anonymous is typically used. You are, when you authenticate anonymously, you do have the guest user identity within Spotfire, and that guest user needs to be given appropriate access to whatever you want to show publicly. For example, a specific analysis file, or a library folder if there's multiple analysis files you want to provide. The key thing is authentication establishes an identity. So once the identity is established, then you can move on to authorization. So we've verified the user is who they say they are, and then once you move on to the authorization, we move on to determining what they can do within the environment. So you can use the Spotfire database as a user directory. In that case, groups are managed within the Spotfire environment, and you can mix and match. So for example, with Active Directory, you can have some external groups and some groups within the Spotfire environment that are managed there. Active Directory groups are synchronized into Spotfire, and they are read-only in the Spotfire environment, so they cannot be manipulated there because they're supported by the Active Directory. The Active Directory is the source of that information. And then SCIM is a system for cross-identity, system for cross-domain identity management, and this is used and can be used with OpenID providers like Okta or Azure, and that's similar to Active Directory, and you can synchronize information into the Spotfire user directory for handling users. So once you've established an authorization, you've established a group membership, so you can control what the users can do, what they can see within the environment, and then within the library and things like that.
We have a question from one of our viewers. It said, I figured out the third-party initiated login URL. Is it possible to set this as your Spotfire server URI for the analyst client?
Yeah, so you can use the Spotfire analyst client the third-party initiated login URL. I'd have to look at that in details, because I'm not sure if because in the third-party initiated login URL, the third party is initiating the login, and in Spotfire analyst case, you're not. The analyst is initiating the login, so I'm not sure that's possible or not. I have to look at that
We can get back to the
yeah, we can get back to that. I mean, that's an interesting
right.
question.
Right.
But yeah, Spotfire Analyst can be used in a OpenID or web authentication process. In that case, and I'll show this later on, the browser will open up and you log in from there. So moving on, I'm going to kind of walk through a little bit of this. I know some of this might be, I'm going to walk through a little bit of this just to show kind of what's the configuration behind the scenes for some of these methods. Not all of them, just a few of them. This, for those who aren't administrators, this is the user GUI configuration tool for the Spotfire server. This provides access to many of the most commonly configured items. You can also do these things from the command line where you can have access to everything. But the first thing you typically do in configuration is determine what authentication method you're going to use. So here's the basic database we talked about. There's LDAP and all the ones we've discussed. Some of these methods, and I'm not going to go into the specifics of this, but some of these methods you can use them together. For example, you can have Active Directory and or you can have a username and password and OpenID at the same time. The key thing, if you do something like that, is obviously the usernames need to match across those. If you can log in either way, and your identity within Spotfire needs to be the same. But you can mix and match some of these, so you have like maybe a primary one and a secondary one. But just to show a little bit, to give a sense of what's behind this. So this is an LDAP login, LDAP configuration. So you have a username and password to the LDAP server. In this case, this can be a read-only user. Spotfire is never writing to the LDAP environment. It's only reading from it. You have one or more server URLs to get to the server, to get to the Active Directory server. In this case, context names. This is how queries are being executed within the environment. So LDAP's kind of a think of it as a database. So you go and search for the users or the groups that you're looking for within there. The other thing is, so I'll just group synchronization. This is commonly used to synchronize groups into the Spotfire environment. And in this case, it is better to have users and groups managed outside of Spotfire. So if a user, for example, leaves the company, you don't have the Spotfire admin doesn't have to go in and remove that user from the Spotfire environment. That can be done externally in the, for example, in this case, in Active Directory. Or if a user changes roles within a company, their group can be modified, and then they get the roles of that group within the Spotfire environment. So, for example, if a user goes from one department to another, or maybe one project to another, that can change. That can be manipulated. One thing about the groups here, here I have named a specific group. You can also use wildcards in here, and those groups will be pulled into Spotfire. And then within Spotfire, you can give them specific features they can access and access to the Spotfire library. Typically, I've seen people like have a Spotfire admin groups and then Spotfire user groups. And depending on how the complexity of the organization, you might have many of those available if needed. I'm just going to flip through a few of these things in here. So post authentication filter. This is where you determine how a user whose identity we've determined, how are they treated when they get to this authorization component? Are they, so again, it's post authentication. So this is after authentication, but prior to a user really having a session within the Spotfire environment, being authorized. So you can either block, which means that I already have to be in the Spotfire user directory to be allowed in, or I can auto create. Auto create's often used when you're using doing OpenID, because the user may not already be in the Spotfire environment. You can also have a custom Java class created and deployed on the Spotfire servers to manipulate this. I've seen use cases for that, or maybe you want to filter users by IP address. Maybe you want to dynamically manipulate group membership as the user's logging in. You can do that as well at this point in the process.
And then I have a question regarding the authentication. So does the server, let's say, periodically checks the user eligibility to be authenticated, or during like a session, or it's going to be like after, let's say, the user logs off and then logs back in, that will be the next check?
It's all, yeah, they're not, once they've logged in, their authentication isn't checked again unless their session times out.
Okay.
So yeah, once they have a session, that session is valid for the duration of the timeout.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, guys. Hello, everyone.
I would
I
say,
Jose.
wanted to join this session. That's pretty cool to know about authentication and authorization.
Yes. So moving on. So external authentication, again, this is used when users might be logging in from a portal or, again, have already externally authenticated. Sometimes this is used if there's a proxy, and the proxy handles the authentication. And then what's passed to Spotfire might be, a header or cookie or some sort of custom component. And then you can pull that out. Again, you can use if you do you can do a custom Java class here as well. So just, there are various hooks within the authentication process if you have a more complex process that needs to be handled. OpenID Connect, again, like I mentioned earlier, this is a common method now, especially on the web, in cloud environments. Just one of the key things I want to point out here. I mean, there's a lot of things here. These are all documented pretty well in the documentation. And the slides that I have links to the documentation and information about that. Just a couple of things to point out here that are important. One is this username claim. So the way that OpenID tokens work is, you log into the provider, for example, in this case, I have Azure as the example. That provider sends a token back to Spotfire. You usually get an access token, an ID token. And within there, you want to figure out, how do you determine who the username is? How do you determine the identity of the user within the Spotfire environment? So the key thing here is, what's the username claim? And so this is a component within those tokens that determines what the username identity is. And in a lot of cases, you need to make sure this matches what's in your user directory. So if you're using, for example, Azure for logging in and then Active Directory maybe for your user directory, then you need to make sure those match. So when the user logs in, Spotfire knows who they are. So that's just something to be aware of if you're involved in this process. And then the other thing is the domain. Is how do you determine what the domain is? That's another critical piece of that. The last thing I'm going to look through here is just when Athir asked this question, this kind of came up a little bit, is security. So this is where you can set different timeouts as far as how long the session is valid for the user. If they're not doing anything, typically sessions stay alive if the user's sitting there doing something. But if they're idle, then when should they have to be when should they have to log in again? So that's just something to be aware of. Typically the defaults are fine, but in some environments, you might need to set different settings depending on what your scenario is.
Yeah, and all of this is well documented, right, in the documentation. So if you have
correct, yeah. So I just want to point it out here. I'm not going to go through the detail of everything, but yeah, it's all in the documentation. This is if you're an admin, and working on this. One thing I do want to show from the user perspective. So I talked about the ability to kind of mix authentication and also using web authentication with Spotfire analysts. So typically, obviously, if you're coming in as a consumer or business author on the web, you're already in the web, so it's not a big deal if you're logging in the web. But it might be a little bit different experience if you're in the Spotfire analyst. So this is a case. I'm in one of my analyst clients here. So this is what pops up. In this case, I have the ability to log in with username and password, or with Azure AD. So if I log in, with the username and password, just to kind of show the whole process. It puts you back in. You can see in the browser window back here, it says authentication successful, and then back in the browser window, or back in the analyst window, I'm just logging in as normal. So once you've gone through that process, the browser kind of just isn't needed anymore. But then it's just a normal login. Just so you're kind of aware, people are probably going to see that more and more, especially with OpenID and web authentication. You'll see the analysts go through that process of using the web browser.
And I can also change the authentication timeout, right? There's a timeout because if I leave the session open for too long, it might close out. That's something I can change on the settings, right?
Correct. Yes. Yeah. The application timeout. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, the session timeouts. Yeah, they're all available there. So I'm going to go back to the. A bunch of slides here are kind of what we've talked about, but they're in the slide deck here for informational purposes. So these are basically the links here are all to the documentation. So I'm not really going to go through these unless there's anything important that I do want to stop on this slide a little bit. Like I've mentioned several times, You'll probably see more and more OpenID connecting your organization, especially as people move their environments to the cloud. So if you'll see the process of logging in. You're probably already using it maybe on some of your web applications already or other applications as well. So one thing that is interesting or to note is that so previously there were various ways to pass your identity or information down to the data source, which we'll talk a little bit more in data security. But when I'm on this slide, I'll talk about a little bit about the you can pass starting in 11.7. You can pass the OAuth token via information services down to data sources. Everything's got to be configured right. This is correctly, but this is similar to Kerberos authentication, where the Spotfire is in we're using single sign-on. So the Spotfire environment is set up to pass your Kerberos token from your login all the way down to the data source. And then also starting in 12.3, the TDV connector, the TIBCO data virtualization or Spotfire Advanced Data Services.
We have a couple of questions from the audience. Okay. One of them is if there are any tips on migrating an existing user group based from Active Directory to OpenID.
Yeah, well, it kind of depends on what your OpenID. If you're going, a lot of people go from Active Directory to Azure. One of the key things is determining what your user directory is going to be. So with Active Directory, it's the and you can use OpenID with Active Directory, assuming like if you're using, for example, Azure and you have them synchronized together. Some people have Azure, basically Azure AD, which is a little bit different than that on-premise Active Directory, honestly. But you can. So that's one way to do it. I mean, the key thing is making sure that your user groups match what you've had previously. So I think that's the key critical thing. Yeah.
And then we have one more right here.
Okay.
Is it possible to assign like a lightweight LDAP group to the Spotfire group's licensing?
Yeah, yes, and that's typically the way. That's typically the way you do it. I mean, the LDAP group can either have the licenses, or you can have an LDAP group be a member of a Spotfire Spotfire group that you created. So yeah, typically people have they have LDAP groups, and then those groups within Spotfire are assigned to are assigned licenses and the privileges within the Spotfire environment. That's typically how it's done. Yeah. Hope that answered your questions.
Yeah, thank you.
So yeah, and the OpenID as a standard, and the SCIM they've talked about systems cross-identity, domain identity management is also another standard that is, again, it's similar to the synchronization we use with Active Directory. It's a different protocol and everything, but it's used in that environment. One thing I want to again I'll talk a little bit about two-factor authentication. Sometimes there's a little bit of discussions about this, but just kind of as a definition, we're all probably similar to used to doing this, especially now. Even on any websites, banking websites we go to, but basically, it's a method of authentication where you have two forms of identification. So, like maybe a PIN or a bank card if you're using an ATM, or a password in your phone if you're doing, two-factor authentication at work or something like that. Spotfire Server does support itself a form of two-factor authentication using X509 certificates, which are similar to SSL certificates, but you have a client certificate, and then it's verified by the server, and some other method of authentication. But typically, when customers or users talk about using two-factor authentication, that two-factor authentication is actually done outside of the Spotfire environment. So your OpenID provider may be doing two-factor authentication, but Spotfire Server doesn't really care about that. All Spotfire Server cares about is getting a token at the end of the day. So Spotfire Server will send you onto your identity provider, and then your identity provider will go through that process of two-factor authentication, and then at the end of the process, Spotfire gets back the tokens as needed to identify you, and then figure out how you fit within the environment.
So basically, you're setting up Spotfire, and the rest of the configuration is for the identity provider.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, a lot of times we'll ask, Spotfire support two-factor authentication. Well, it's really not. Yeah. Again, it's not Spotfire doing the two-factor authentication. It's your provider doing that. Yeah. That's an external custom authentication. I'll pause on this. There is the ability to do SAML integration with Spotfire. It requires some extra configuration, and there's a community article about that will be helpful setting that up. We kind of talked about this. There's some extension points. Again, you can pretty much do. I've been doing this a long time, and there's pretty much we can handle almost any authentication scenario. Some obviously might be more complex than others, but there are various hooks that allow you to kind of manipulate what's going on during the process if it doesn't fit any of one of the out of the box configurations. So now we'll move on. Any more questions before I move on? Okay. So we're going to user and group management. So within user and group management, so you can separate roles like we're talking about via groups, and separate what a user can do and what they should be doing in the environment. And then the Spotfire library, you can manage, you can govern who has access to what within that. And then you can again link these externally to Active Directory, LDAP, or custom and everything. So again, the Spotfire authorization is handled by the user directory. Maps users.
We have another question from Jim. He said from JM. When signing in with an OpenID, one can also match the authentication attributes towards LDAP. I'm not sure if that's a question or
LDAP.
comment.
Yeah, it's more like a comment, I think.
I think that's a comment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Sorry,
you can. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, you can. So as far as authorization, so you can use either the Spotfire database or LDAP or some other external system for in this is the authorization. Sorry. Can you still hear me?
Yes, yeah, we can.
You can use the Spotfire, what a user can do and what they have access to, and everything within the environment. And then you can also use groups to control, like routing within the environment and deployment areas. So we'll kind of look at the features and licenses that people have access to. So I'm gonna go over here to my other. Oops. Let me see. Okay. Yeah. No, this one. So in this, one of the things is some of these administration. I'm in the analyst, Spotfire analyst. I'm an administration manager, and those who are administrators will have seen this. Those who aren't won't have seen this before, obviously. But you can do some of this. You can do a lot of this from the web now, but there are a few things you can't. You can do groups and licenses from the web. So just to show what licenses are. So this is basically, they're called licenses. They're features within the environment. What features do you have access to? So
features or permissions, right? Kind of type of thing.
Right, features or permissions. Yeah. Some people get confused about licenses because they're, historically licenses have been like you have a license file, you do this, do that. But really, it's features within the environment. So, for example, I can control what connectors people have access to. Now, this isn't what they can read a connection that's already created, but this is me creating a connection, from the get-go, having access to those. I can control down in the Spotfire analyst. I can control, down to what charts I can create. Typically people kind of pick, high-level things here. I guess one of the things I'll point out, it is important if you're doing like scripting or custom queries. There are specific licenses, features, you have to allow people to do to be able to be a script author or a custom query author, and that's important to know. But yeah, this is just how you would go about controlling who has access to what they can do within the environment. So obviously, a consumer and a business author has different capabilities than a user of analyst. But so then again,
groups in the organization, and then you assign permission to these. You have your developers, your end users, your
correct. Yeah. So a lot of these groups here are actually the built-in groups. This is the author group is one I created here. I don't have this hooked up to Active Directory or LDAP, but you could see a list of Active Directory groups here. and again, while I can't change their, if I go to properties, I wouldn't be able to edit their members here. I would be able to assign licenses to those groups and control what the user can do. The other thing is preferences, and preferences kind of run the gamut of a lot of different things. It can be like some sort of color schemes, or different groups need to have different capabilities. There's various preferences on various charts you can see here. You can use this for configuring different things. For example, if I go to the application here, preferences, there's a ton listed about. These are kind of defaults of things. So how do you set the defaults? You can change the defaults behavior for various things for different groups, and what they how things behave when they log in, or how they behave when they're using the application.
So the famous HTML sanitation is somewhere here in the text area option, right?
I never can remember where that is, but
yeah, it's a text area thing, but yeah.
So you can enable it, and you can do it again. You can do that per group. So this could be per group. So you could set it for everyone, and then you could set it for author. And there is information if you look at the help about how conflicts are resolved, as far as if you're a member of multiple groups and they have different preferences set. There's information about, you can set up what's called a primary group. Licenses are additive.
We have a question. So these settings can be done both in web and.
Yeah, that's correct. So I don't know if I have.
But not the preferences, right? Only the.
No, the preferences cannot be. So if I
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm already I already had this up. The group's author, you can see the licenses here are.
There's another question from David. Is it possible to limit the pages and filters that different users can see in the same dashboard?
Yeah, they're not necessarily. I don't know about the filters. There is some. I think there's a script example about how to limit what pages people see based on the groups they're a member of. I think there's an example of that on the community, but I don't remember for sure.
Yeah, that requires other approach. It's not from here.
You can't control from here. This is really more general stuff, but you can. There is the way, not necessarily filters, although I guess you could script that probably. But there is the way to limit. With a little bit of scripting, you can limit the pages, and probably the filters too that users can see.
Here's another interesting question from Daniel Celta. It says, under preference, you can control the Ticus Spotfire statistical engine URL to the S+ server engines or whatnot, but can you do the same when connecting to the node manager to engines like Ter or Python?
I think Peter's connection is.
Oh, Peter, are you there? Oh, maybe he's having trouble connecting. Oh, he's back. He's back.
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay, well, we're gonna read that question.
So the TSS, the TSS one, the issue there is that in the TSS settings, which are in here, they were talking about. This is actually informative to give information. So you could have different ones in here per group because that's the way the preferences work. But when you're connecting through the node manager, you're getting that information from Spotfire server, and there's no way to there isn't a way to do that. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So we kind of that's what I didn't show actually. Was the other thing that you can't do in the web yet is library administration, and you don't have to be an admin to be a library administrator. Those are separate. Those can be separate roles. So a lot of times I actually have seen customers. Maybe they have a library administrator that administers the library for their department or division, and they would only see maybe their, for example, HR, finance, or in whatever department they're a member of, they would only see maybe their library folder in here, but they could manage that themselves, so the IT doesn't have to manage that, or they could manage it within the department. So one thing in here, just for library permissions, so you can control by groups or users. So I can add a group in the various permissions here. So access, that doesn't give you access to, it only gives you access to get stuff out of a folder. So for example, an information link or a data connection, that will allow you to, if you could open an analysis file if you had browse access to it, but then the information link can be in a folder where you have access. So you can't see what's in that folder, but you can access things in there if they're requested by something else. To open an analysis file, you would need browsing access. So that way you can browse the library folder structure and open analysis. Browse access modify is being able to modify. So, write or, modify elements. And then the full control allows you to do the permissions and everything else in there.
Yeah, and just like in anything, you have a great responsibility you have when dealing with permissions. You better be careful with that.
Correct, yeah. And one thing while I'm on the library, I mean, this isn't about library, but this is about security. But one thing is to make sure when you are creating the library is, give it some structure, come up with some structure to have within it as Spotfire is growing in your environment, because otherwise it becomes a mess and then you have to come back and deal with it later on.
Because the permissions are in the folder level, right? Not at the individual.
Correct, yeah, permissions are on the folder level. So then I have some slides to back up what we just kind of went through. So, obviously access to library items you can control. And again, this is, you can control these by username, but usually these are done at the group level, so you don't have to manage, each individual user. Then again, we talked about the licenses, the features, and then default preferences. So the last thing we're gonna, one other thing is there are some web services for externally controlling what we've been talking about. So there's some web services for the user directory and for the Spotfire library that are really useful if, I've seen this used a lot in multi-tenant environments, when you might have an onboarding process for a customer, and part of that process, you can programmatically, modify the Spotfire user directory, manipulating groups and users for that, maybe for that tenant. And then also you can manipulate the Spotfire library, so you could maybe copy folders or make new folders and then set the permissions on those folders using web services. So again, I've seen this used typically in maybe in a multi-tenant environment, where we have some outside process doing something, and then you want to put that into Spotfire. And those users want to use Spotfire. So now on a data governance. So this is the last thing we're going to talk about, is a couple of things. So there's two main ways to get data into Spotfire. One is information services. With information services, you can secure how that data is brought in. You can either have a service account, which is common, or you can have each user log in. You can also do a kind of single sign-on or user authentication to the data source using Kerberos, if you have Kerberos configured all the way through the environment, or OAuth 2 since 11.7 in information services. Information services, metadata, and data sources are all stored in the Spotfire library and governed by library permissions. So you can control who has access to which data sources via that way. So if they don't have access to the library folder, then they can't access that information service, that information link. For Spotfire connectors, they're a little bit more ad hoc by default, and that's part of the reason to use them. But it's also a little bit of, it can be, you need to be careful how you use these. So data connections, they can be stored in the analysis or the library. If they're stored in the analysis file, that makes them obviously harder to govern and manage. It's better to store them store the data connections in the library rather than the analyst file, because if you have to change something.
We have a question from JM. Says, is there a routing rule that can be set up to get users to specific TER or Python?
At this point, I'm not aware of any routing rules to do that. That would probably be a good, I don't know if there's an idea in the ideas portal already for that, but that'd be my suggestion, is to put that up there. But that probably is that's a good suggestion.
Another question from David. Can you explain about database access for the dashboard and in users access to that dashboard?
Yeah, so I'll do the first part of, the latter part first. So the user's access to the dashboard is controlled by the library permissions, and then if they can browse to that dashboard and then they can open it, then after that, as the analysis is opening, it determines whether they can access the data. So if an information link is in a folder that user has access to, then they can open that information link. Similar with data connections, they have to have permissions to the folder in which those the data access components live or exist within the library.
Yeah, so in other words, if you have analysis in a folder and you have access to that analysis and everything, but there's another folder where that analysis consumes data from. Usually you have a folder with information links for everyone to share, but if you don't have access or that you don't have access to that folder, then you are not going to be able to see the data.
Correct. Yeah, you'll get an error message. You can't open the data for it. So yeah. So Spotfire connectors, again, that by default, they usually store them in the analysis file. You can save them to the library later on. It's better to store these connections in the library, because then again you can manage them better. So if you need to change the credentials in them, or change the change some configure, you don't have to go to every analysis file that has the connectors within them. You can store the username or password in the connection, but it's not that's not considered a good idea. You can prompt the user. You can use OAuth 2 support for TDV. Again, this is starting in 12.3. You can use what's called, we haven't really talked much about web player and automation services and kind of the automated processes that can be done, but there's a thing called credentials profiles that allows you, when you're kind of in a headless mode, for example, there's no user there, there's no user to interact with the analysis. You can set a username and password to use when the connection is opened with no user there. So data level security. So you can kind of imagine that some of the things we've talked about, as far as the user logging in themselves, can be used to access to secure data. You can also have some sort of service account, or there are also some built-in variables within the Spotfire environment for current user groups and user domain. These can be used either within a query to personalize the query, or you can also, some databases support setting a context when the user logs in. So you can, as a session begins, you can set the context to the current user and determine, and then let the database determine, what data access they have. You can also, as we were just kind of talking about, you can have, you can control data access by securing the library and the information links so a user can see and access.
Question: what are the data tables that get generated in database for Spotfire server? Will it be good to build a dashboard based on Spotfire server database? That's an interesting question. We have something with the application profiler, but I don't know if it's related to.
Yeah, there's no data tables in the Spotfire database. The Spotfire database is meant for it's just meant for metadata. But I have seen users build dashboards on that on the Spotfire database. If you're an admin and you want to maybe get a different level of information from the database, the Spotfire library is also stored, or the Spotfire library, at least information, as well as the data, can be stored in the Spotfire database. So the Spotfire database has, a lot of information in it. It may or may not be useful, but yeah, I have seen customers build build analyses on there. Obviously, you'd want to keep those within the admin, within the admin groups for determining, for seeing what they could see within there. I've seen it especially used for the library.
There's another comment from Daniel Celta. It says some organizations like upgrading the most current long-time support version depending on the preferences, but I also seen that many fail to apply the hot fixes. Can you comment on the risk of not applying hot fixes? That's a very good comment, Daniel. I think it's important to keep up to date with the hot fixes, not necessarily with the latest version, but yeah, many companies tend to have the long-term support version, and the hot fixes is something that you should always apply.
Yeah, that's correct. And some hotfixes, obviously, I mean, they're marked as such, but yeah, it is important to keep up to date on the hotfixes. That makes it easier also when you're dealing with any issues because they might have already been fixed in previous. But from a security perspective, yeah, keeping up to date on hotfixes is important. So one last little thing, we haven't really mentioned much about scheduled updates, but scheduled updates allows you to pin a analysis file in the web player instance. So the data is loaded. You can schedule when that's done. You can have it updated every once in a while, but you can have it loaded, in the morning or something, and then have it stay there all day. But one question that you may be asking is, how do you do row level security with this? Because the user's not the one logging in and dealing with that, opening that analysis. It's kind of a common user. So the idea is you can do you can open up the shared data, which is usually larger data, and then when the user logs in, you can control it by who the user is logging in. You can bring in their private data and join those tables together, and then the user only sees what they should see. And I have a resources slide in here that has a couple links to some articles, some knowledge-based articles about how to do that. But yeah, it uses the joining of two tables. So you have the larger table and the private data table, and you join those get joined when the user logs in. And it's a lot faster than it happening if you're pulling all the data in, or if you wait for the user to log in to pull the data, because you've already had the larger shared data in memory.
We have another question from Rajesh. Can you please elaborate on the authentication mechanism of Spotfire Cloud and then how the group's users folders are being created on the go?
If you're talking about the public cloud, I don't know specifically what I think they're using some sort of OpenID, but I'm not for sure what they're doing. But they're probably using some of the web services we've talked about and some of the other management hooks that we've talked about for manipulating users as they're being created and onboarded. But I don't know for sure actually what the Spotfire Cloud is doing. So yeah, I just want to briefly go over here. We kind of looked a little bit at things, but just to kind of information designer. If I have my data source, obviously as we talked about, you can set the username and password here, or I can do a user authentication. One thing I will show here too also is I can do we're talking about security, so I can set up what we call row level security. So if I in this case I'm joining with my permissions table, and then I'm setting the Spotfire user to the current user. So this is kind of another way to do row level security. There's a couple of other different ways, but this is one of the ways that we were talking about. But this is basically just the the idea of in the end you get a where clause to the database, determining what data the user can see. And just to briefly show the data connections. So I have a data connection. When I was talking about managing the data connections, so I can manage the data connections in the library. If I, oops, sorry, this is the wrong edit. This edit. Let me skip entering username and password, but I can, we were talking about the settings for the data source. Here are the credential settings, so I'm not saving the data credentials. You saw it pop up. I can use a credentials profile. I can't save, but as it says right here, saved credentials can be a security risk. Username and password is stored unencrypted. One of the reasons is for this, if you think about it, this connection has to be opened on my machine and some other people's machines, the web player. So it's kind of hard to encrypt that because there's no standard machine that it's going to be set on. So you can't use any sort of like machine encryption for that setup. So yeah, some additional considerations. We kind of talked about this. It's best to use HTTPS and LDAP wherever. Securing things is the best thing to do, and then adding hotfixes as well. And there's some security resources here that link to various things we talked about. There is a really good Spotfire server and environment security document that kind of goes through various questions that sometimes people have about ports being used, encryption methods for various things being used within the environment. So yeah, that's all I have. Are there any more questions?
I don't see any questions. So thank you, Peter, for the session today. And for all our viewers, stay tuned for the next session, which is about the optimization and performance. Would you like to give a brief summary for that, Peter?
Yeah, the next session will be the kind of the last session of these kind of more enterprise backend platform discussions. We'll be talking about monitoring the environment, performance and scalability, and things like that, about what kind of you can do to work to
Okay.
do that within the Spotfire environment. Yeah.
We have one last question before we wrap up from Rajesh.
Okay.
What is the best possible way to handle the schedule updates for analysis? Example, like setting the max jobs, max connections, information links, concurrent updates.
Well, the max jobs, that's really an overall system thing, so that wouldn't affect really the scheduled update necessarily. Max connections in information services, so that if you're using scheduled updates, that kind of limits or decreases the need for that to be high, because you're opening the analysis file only kind of one time, and then a lot of users can use it. What was the last item? Concurrent updates. Concurrent updates is so concurrent updates. If you're talking about the concurrent updates for the scheduled updates, then that determines how many scheduled updates can run at one time. So you would have to set that. I think the default is 2, which might be kind of low, but also you want to be aware that the rest of your system can handle that. So that the rest of your system or the rest of the environment is the Spotfire server, but also the data source. So if you're loading a lot of scheduled updates, and that's scheduled updates per web player as well. So you have lots of web players running, and your database may not be able to handle all those running at one time. That's something to think about. But yeah, those all can kind of affect, but it kind of depends on the environment as well. Hopefully that kind of gave you there's lots of details around that if you. But hopefully that gave you the first.
All right. So if everyone have a questions, keep sending them to the comments, or you can just email drspotfire@co.com. Stay tuned for the next session. That will be on first Tuesday of August, which is the 1st of August. And then thank you for joining us, and then enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.